The power of faith. With the coming of Shavuos, Baruch saw his last few coins disappearing. For this holy Yom Tov, he had to have chalas at least for Kiddush. This holy Yom Tov, the time of the giving of our Torah, could not be slighted. What then must he do? He decided to fast on the few days preceding Yom Tov, so that he would manage to buy his indispensable chalas for the festival. But what was to happen after Yom Tov? He had absolutely reached the end of his resources and was very worried indeed. He blamed himself severely. Why could he not have a deeper trust in God? Baruch was at that time studying many books on Musar, and he appreciated how great a virtue was faith. But could this virtue be practiced at a time when one felt so helpless and without a cent to call one's own? Baruch felt he must elevate himself to such a high level that even in his desperate plight he could yet feel that he need not lose faith in the Almighty for one moment. Not for him to question the how, when, and what. He had but to rely upon the Almighty, who sustained all his creatures and would surely also sustain him. Besides, this festive season was hardly the time for depression. Shavuos was near, and nature was emerging in all her loveliness. One had but to go out into the country, leaving behind the town and its poverty, its trials and tribulations, and give oneself up completely to God's wonderful creation. What beauty one now beheld, and how one's heart rejoiced! Who ever heard of worry? Here was a world where all creation was singing a song of praise to the Creator. At such times, Baruch felt himself to be part of this creation and in close communion with the Divine One himself. At such times, too, it was impossible to think of such mundane things as one's body and its physical needs. The soul entirely superseded the body. Shavuos went by, leaving Baruch without a cent. Then began for him an unbroken series of fasts. Now he did not fast for the sake of saving food, but simply because he had no food to eat. But how long can one fast? He tried to spend his days in the fields, under the open sky, engrossed in deep thought. He also tried to go over by heart all he had learned. His hunger, however, gnawed at his stomach. His strength gradually weakened, and his senses began to feel dulled. Baruch could only refresh himself with cold water from a nearby river, but after 2 days had passed without a morsel of food entering his lips, even the cold water failed to refresh him. Driven by hunger, he went in search of grasses that were edible, and found some sorrel. He swallowed several handfuls of the sorrel, and then drank some water after it. But such a diet after his long, unbroken fast could only cause him stomachache. The pain lasted for hours, and when it finally passed, he again felt the pangs of hunger. Baruch could no longer find any peace in the fields, and decided to return to the town. He thought of knocking at the first house he came to ask for a piece of bread. Surely no one would refuse such a request. Then perhaps he would recover his strength. Here indeed was a test. For over 3 years he had kept himself by his own efforts. Should he suddenly change his ways now? He couldn't make up his mind to do it. He was in truth in danger of his life, but he felt that even in these circumstances he must not lose faith in God and not turn for help to mere flesh and blood. Hungry and weak, Baruch walked into town with dragging footsteps. He followed a new path, passing houses and gardens he had never seen before. They happened to be houses belonging to Jews who earned their livelihood by gardening and doing such jobs as did not entail their having to live in the narrow streets of the town. Baruch passed a vegetable garden, and through the fence he saw a Jew weeding and watering the plants. Noticing Baruch, he asked him if he would like to help. "I'll pay you for it," he added. "There's far too much for me to do on my own." Baruch was delighted. It was the first time that anyone in Liozna had offered him work. This was, in fact, what he had been looking for all the time. He jumped at the offer. Baruch learnt that the garden was owned jointly by this gardener, whose name was Avram, and his partner Israel. Avram was anxious that the lad should be satisfied. He gave him bread and greens and a drink, and Baruch felt his strength returning to him. Baruch was to board and lodge with his employer. It was just the time of year when the greens were ripe for gathering and taking into town for selling. For 3 weeks Baruch had a home with food and in addition some extra money for his work. Baruch's conscientious devotion to his work pleased the gardener greatly. When the work in the garden came to an end, he did not want to part with Baruch. In addition to his vegetable garden, the gardener owned an orchard which, together with a partner, he had rented from a neighboring landowner. The fruit in the orchard was beginning to ripen, and it was now time to keep watch to see that no thieves or birds helped themselves to the fruit of the tree. Later, it would also be necessary to engage people to pick the fruit and pack it in wagons for taking it to town. It was a job of several weeks' duration. Baruch agreed to stay on condition that he should be allowed to go into town to daven with a minyan every morning and evening. To this the old gardener agreed. The time of hunger was over for Baruch, and he felt that his great trust in God had not been in vain. A new life commenced for Baruch. He became a watchman and stayed in a small hut which was in the middle of the orchard. Baruch was now right in the bosom of nature, which all his life he loved so dearly. Roving through the orchard by day and by night, he could indulge in dreaming his dreams. He could admire God's creation and spend most of his time in the study of the Torah and the worship of God. One thing troubled him, however. He had no holy books for his studies. He was not allowed to bring them from town, as they were not loaned out from the Beis HaMedrash. There was no one he knew from whom he could borrow such books, even if he would have cared to attract attention to his studiousness, which he certainly did not wish for. And so, during the first few days that he acted as watchman, he had to satisfy himself with merely reviewing by heart all he had previously learned. He would have liked to learn something more, something new, but for this he needed books. Then he remembered the old man in the Beis HaMedrash on the outskirts of Liozna, where he had stayed a long time. Baruch decided he would go and have a talk with him and ask for permission to borrow some books from the Beis HaMedrash. The old man readily agreed and allowed him to borrow whatever he chose. Now Baruch was completely happy. He could sit in the orchard and study to his heart's content. Twice daily he went into town to daven with a minyan. On the way to and from town, he used to review all he had learned in the orchard. He hadn't much work to do in the orchard. All he had to do was walk about and keep watch that no cattle should stray in, and no bird should spoil the fruit, and that none of the neighborhood peasants should steal any of the fruit. Thus Baruch had enough time for study and for concentrated thought on lofty ideas. While Baruch was in the orchard, he was careful about every mitzvah. Every Shabbos he made an Eruv Techumen so that on Shabbos he could also go to town and return. But on the first Shabbos, on his return from the Beis HaMedrash in the morning, he suddenly reminded himself that he had made no arrangements with his employer about being released from his obligations of protecting the orchard against the birds on Shabbos. He also remembered that he had not arranged with his employer not to receive payment for Shabbos day. He pondered the matter and decided that he must ask his employer to engage a non-Jew to act as watchman on Shabbos and deduct the day's pay from Baruch's wages. The fact that he had not had the forethought to see to these matters before Shabbos upset Baruch very much. Did it not show that he was not careful enough with regard to his religious duties? Did it not prove that in spite of all his sufferings and sacrifices, he was still a long way from his goal? He took himself severely to task. How could he have overlooked such definite dinim? How could he have been so thoughtless? That Shabbos was certainly spoiled for him. He paced up and down the orchard, trying to see how he could rectify his failing. Baruch finally decided upon a self-imposed punishment as a form of repentance. First, he decided that he must leave the orchard at the risk of again experiencing hunger. At the same time, he would spend all his time praying to God for forgiveness for his faults, promising to avoid them in the future. He had even decided how he would arrange his term of repentance, which was to last for 3 weeks. He would abstain from food for 3 consecutive days. Then he would fast regularly twice a week. During the fast, he would study Talmud right through the night and only sleep for 2 to 3 hours during the day. During these 3 weeks, he would also set himself the task of learning by heart the whole of Tractate Shabbos. Having decided upon his penance, he felt much lighter-hearted. Immediately the next day, he went to his employer and told him that something had happened which necessitated him giving up his job for a certain period of time, and during that time his employer would have to employ another watchman in his place. The old gardener begged him to stay another day, and promised to go into the matter on the following day. He told Baruch it would be terribly difficult for him to find a suitable person upon whom he could rely, and it might even take a few days before he can get anyone to replace him. Baruch returned to the orchard at the same time, preparing himself for his penance.